and welcome once again to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific, brought to you by our producer, IEJ Media, and our sponsor, Bauer Group Asia. More about them in due course. I'm Ray Powell. I'm the former military officer. I am in California. I am joined by my co-host, Jim Carouso in New York. Jim, how are you?
I am well, just returned from Asia, including Vietnam, which is where our guest is calling in from today.
That is, in fact, the case. Eric Olander is a veteran journalist. He is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the China Global South Project. He has over 30 years of international media experience at organizations that include CNN, the BBC, and France 24. And he specializes in China's engagement with the developing world, or what we like to call the Global South. So, Eric Olander, we have to ask you our catchy first question. Why should our audience care if China wants to lead the Global South?
Well, it just depends because, from all of our lives, the United States and the Western powers have set the rules of international engagement and international standards, certainly in the post-war era. And, if 400 years of economic history teaches us anything, that the country that has the largest economy gets to set the rules. Now, China still doesn't have the largest economy, but they're starting to set more of the rules of how we do things in the international arena, whether that is technology standards, auto standards, safety standards, communication standards. Pick your standard that you want. And if you are comfortable with the Chinese setting the rules, then there's nothing to worry about because that's what's happening. But if you are not comfortable with it, then you should probably care about this. And what's happening at the UN and other international fora, increasingly Chinese standards on governance are becoming more and more common and the norm as the U.S. retreats. So this is relevant, just depends on how much you care about U.S. Leadership.
Well, Eric, does the Global South care? Do countries care that this leadership is passing apparently from the U.S. to China?
The Global South, I mean, again, this is a very rich tapestry of countries. It's a
Right.
terrible word to use to describe such a diverse group. We just don't have a better word to do it. So developing world, Global South, but even developing world doesn't really fit because you have countries like Singapore that sit in the middle of this. So it's a bad word, and we all acknowledge that. But that being said, most countries around the world do care and have a vested interest because they're looking for stability. They're looking for prosperity for their people. Now, the United States, in its international system that it built in the post-war era, didn't really deliver the goods universally for everybody. So if you're sitting in parts of Africa, or certainly even here in parts of Asia, the post-war era, the Cold War, was quite turbulent. So it's not that a lot of people are looking back on the post-war era in the U.S.-led system with a lot of sentimentality. I'm sitting here in Vietnam. Clearly, the United States has a troubled history in this part of the world, given what it did in Vietnam. So it's not necessarily that they're longing for the U.S. and they're skeptical of the Chinese. They just want stability. And if the Chinese can bring them stability, then great, let's do that. If the U.S. can do it, great, we'll do that. That's where I think they're coming from a much more pragmatic point of view.
Okay, so Eric Olander, editor-in-chief of the China Global South Project. Where did this term that you don't like come from? I mean, you named your your site after it. You named your podcast after it. Why? When I was growing up, we didn't talk about the Global South. Of course, back then we talked about the Third World. Then we talked about the developing world. Now we're talking about the Global South. Why are we talking
Yeah.
about the Global South?
Well, it's a word, and one of the reasons we do like the word and the framing of it is because it's how countries in the developing world describe themselves. And if you go back to the 1955 Bandung Africa-Asia Summit in Indonesia, they talked a lot about South-South cooperation, South-South engagement. And so a lot of countries in this part of the world do refer to themselves as the South. They see the North as it's really an opposition to the North, and the North is seen as Europe, U.S., Japan. And in many ways, the thing that binds a lot of these countries together is a shared history of colonialism, a shared history of exploitation. And so they use that reference themselves. And you'll hear the Chinese say it, you'll hear the Indonesians will say it, Africans also use it in terms of South-South engagement, South-South cooperation. And so that's one of the reasons why we chose the word in part, because it is a term that the global south uses to describe itself. Again, I think most people would say it's an imperfect framing of it, but at least for now. Now, the third world was obviously, that's a geopolitical academic term. We had the first world, the second world, and then the third world. That doesn't really apply in this era where we're not in a Soviet US type of standoff. And so the language has not caught up with the times. And that's in a lot of different areas. So until there's a better way, people also say the global majority, that's kind of ambiguous too. We just don't know what that is. But there is a coalition of countries that form around the G77 that align now increasingly in the BRICS, that do see that they have common interests, that in many respects they have been excluded from many of the privileges of the G7 and in terms of norm setting. So S. Jaishankar, the external affairs minister of India, he said, listen, we wanted to participate in the G7, but they told us no. So we had to make our own group, and that's why India joined the BRICS. And so I think in that sense, that's where the global south gets its power from, is because it's a term that is used commonly among countries in the global south.
There are a lot of folks, we'll call them maybe not that familiar with Asia, but who think that we have shared interests with a lot of these countries, especially in Asia, things like democracy and these so-called shared values. Uh, do they have a point at all?
I don't know when you say we who you're talking about, because the United States policy today is not democracy promotion. The United States and Europe are moving into a post-liberal societies where democracy is in retreat. And so I don't know if the US has the credibility to talk to anybody today about democracy. And this has been something that I think has been building over 10, 15 years. So it's not actually even a Trump or MAGA phenomenon. And by the way, that has largely disappeared from the discourse. The United States is not going around talking about rights and values and democracy and equality. That language has all been removed from U.S. diplomacy today. So
Well,
so I
for the past
wonder
8 months.
who were. Yeah, but again, I think there was a reservoir of frustration that Trump tapped into. That, I mean, it was so easy for him to tip the balance to stop talking about these things. There hasn't been any resistance in the United States to the cutting off of USAID in any meaningful way. I mean, sure, people who had a vested interest in it, the Kansas farmers and the people who worked at USAID, are upset about it, but there aren't riots in the streets saying we want to give $10 billion to Africa. So I think there was a reservoir of a demand for this in the US, and just as in Europe too. And by the way, China's the same way. You go into any, Chinese cafe in a mid-tier, city, and you say, do you want to give aid to Africa? They'll say no. So this is not even uniquely an American phenomenon.
Okay, let's take a step back here and kind of get around to back to China and its leadership within the global
Yeah.
south. So China seems to be trying to cast itself as leader of the global south. Would you agree with that? And why do they want, if so, why do they want to do that?
So China has been very articulate that it definitely sees itself as a leader of developing countries. And this is something that it competes vigorously with India for the mantle of a leader of the global south. India, too, makes that same claim as well. Indonesia, by the way, also makes that claim. Indonesia, because of its history in the non-aligned movement, sees itself as the heart and the spiritual core of the global south. And that's one of the reasons why you see Prabowo speaking out so forcefully on issues like Gaza and others. So this is, by the way, a contested space in terms of who is the leader. It's, again, a ridiculous statement. None of these countries want another country to, quote unquote, lead them. It was the same idea that, America is the leader of the free world. If you went to Sweden or to Norway or to Holland, they would think that's ridiculous. But nonetheless, we have these values. The Chinese do see an opportunity right now. And again, this goes back to our opening point that we talked about in terms of norm setting. This is a coalition of countries that is incredibly important to China for a number of different reasons. Number one is the fact that China is allowed to be able to advance its international priorities because it has built up these coalitions in places like the UN, at the UN Human Rights Council, at the UN agencies, pick your international fora. And so what it can do is it can stymie debates about the South China Sea, Taiwan, Xinjiang, Tibet, human rights, and those countries around the world that also share the frustration of what they see as duplicity, that it's mostly brown and black people and a few Yugoslavians who brought before the International Criminal Court, but it's never an American, it's never a French, it's never a Dutch. And so they see that as absolute hypocrisy. The Chinese also leverage their, again, colonialism is something that feels ancient to Americans or to Europeans, but it's very fresh in many parts of the world, including here in Southeast Asia. The Chinese leverage their shared colonial trauma to be able to say, listen, these assholes exploited you and they exploited us. We have something in common. Let's now align ourselves, for an interest that's our interest and not their interests. So on issues like debt and governance and human rights and internet sovereignty, all these different issues that are important to the Chinese, increasingly they see a very willing audience in places like Africa, Latin America, Asia, and other places.
You don't see any concern, at least in Southeast Asia, about Chinese claims in South China Sea, for instance?
Oh, no, 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 please do not. Oh, there's concerns all over the place. But there's also a recognition that there's not that much that countries can do to change the status quo against a power that is as strong as China is. So certainly Vietnam has concerns about this. The Philippines, as you guys cover quite a bit, has concerns about this. Taiwan has concerns about it. Even in Indonesia, over the Natuna Islands, they do, but those are more muted concerns. Malaysia has also more muted concerns, but there is a concern. There is a suspicion of Chinese power in this part of the world because the Chinese have in the past, as we know, any cursory look at Chinese history in Asia, has been a dominant hegemonic power for millennia. But also there is a recognition that says we're not 100% sure that the current hegemonic power, the United States, is going to put itself on the line to defend us in the event that China wants to change the status quo. And Ray, I saw your testimony, in Congress, and I think Capitol Hill is detached from reality. And that a lot of these countries now are losing faith in the United States, which is one of the reasons why this week we saw the first participation of the Japanese Aviation Defense Force doing exercises with the Philippines. They are placing their bets now across the table because they don't have the confidence that the United States is going to be as reliable a partner.
Okay, so then that brings us to sort of this question of, to what extent is this rhetoric about the global South, to what extent is it a real thing? In other words, is there actually an identification with a community of nations called the global South that should hang together and push back against the global North? I mean, and then to what extent is it just basic hedging? It's China seems to be rising, the US seems to be withdrawing. I guess we ought to move in that direction.
Yes to both. I mean, it's not an either or proposition. They do see China as a developing country that's increasingly becoming an advanced economy. And you have to remember, I'm 54. No, I'm 55. I keep forgetting.
Young man.
This is one of the hazards of getting older, is you forget how old you are. In my lifetime, I was 18 years old the first time I went to China. And in China at 18, when I was 18 in 1988, 89, there were ration coupons. There was no infrastructure. China had the per capita income less than Botswana. And so countries see the trajectory of what China has done in one lifetime. And they look and say, that's what I want for my people, and that's what I want for me. So China is a development model. And bear in mind, they modernized without Westernizing. That too is a very big appeal for many parts of the world. We have this arrogance that everybody wants to be like us. That was what I grew up in, you too, that everybody wants to come to America and everyone wants to be American, and that's not true. And so when the Chinese showed an example of modernizing without Westernizing, a lot of countries look at that as very appealing. And there's a lot of soft power in that, which is one of the reasons why when you go on to X and you look at Chinese diplomatic posts on X, it's basically just a litany of infrastructure porn. Look at our subway, look at our highways, look at our bridges, you know. And that to us kind of seems like, okay, you know, we have highways and subways and bridges, not as nice as they do, but we still have them. But if you're sitting in Vietnam or you're sitting in Mali or you're sitting in Ecuador, you go, that looks pretty good. I like that. That's what I want. And this question of rights and civil and political rights, you know, a couple years ago, I took my team out here in Vietnam and I asked them, I said, if you could have any system in the world, what would you want? And arrogantly, I assumed that they would want a Western democracy and they want freedom and they want the civil and political rights. And the team said, we want to have good functioning schools. We want good functioning sewage. We want good functioning streets. We want good functioning, you know, housing. That's what most people want. The civil and political rights that we emphasize are usually not at the top of the list for most people who are struggling in economic realms. And so the Chinese have that language as well, and that reverberates quite effectively here.
So you talked about infrastructure. This brings up the Belt and Road
Yeah,
Initiative and Chinese ability to provide infrastructure, which apparently the West cannot. You've somewhat controversially said the debt trap argument that China's goal is to create a debt trap for the countries which borrow from them to create the infrastructure is not accurate. Could
correct.
you explain that a bit?
Correct. I don't, and then again, I get accused of being a CCP apologist when I say this, and it has nothing to do with, you know, defending or criticizing the CCP. They can do that themselves. They're more than capable of doing that. I don't care if the Chinese succeed or fail in this realm. What I care about is the fact: is there any evidence that supports the assertion that the Chinese are intentionally loading up developing countries with unsustainable amounts of debt in pursuit of seizing assets or extracting political concessions? That is the debt trap as it's been laid out by Brahmachalani in 2017, who's an Indian pundit, and then propagated by the US and Europe ever since. We just don't have the evidence of it. And you can do a Google search now, China debt trap, and you will see research from Boston University, Chatham House, Johns Hopkins. Go down the list of major research institutions that have scoured Chinese loans and Chinese debt, and there is no evidence of it. What there is evidence is that China is in pursuit of cash. These are profit seeking ventures that they're doing. So they don't want the port of Mombasa. Okay. They want the capital from the port of Mombasa, the cash from the port of Mombasa. So if you read the contracts, they're very clear that they want to get repaid and they want to get repaid with interest, which makes them no different than UBS or JP Morgan or Deutsche Bank or Bank of America. These are much more profit seeking ventures than geopolitical ventures. And that's been our reading. And one of the things that we do is we put this through our historical lens. The reason why we talk about, you know, seizing assets and land and things like that is because that's what we did in our history. So that's what we assume the Chinese are doing with theirs. That's not what's happening. It's just not what's happening. And that's the frustration on this debt trap. And what it does is it ultimately undermines the US in particular. When people like Joe Biden last year in a roundtable of Latin American leaders talks about the debt trap, and all of those leaders at the table are like thinking to themselves, did you have it? No, you don't have a debt. I don't have a debt trap. Do you? No, do you? No, I don't. And because it isn't true, it makes us look stupid, and it shows a rigidity in our political system that cannot absorb new information. And so when you go onto the front page of a Google search, and when you see the research from BU and on Harvard Business School and others that's there to debunk it, and yet leaders are continuing to propagate it, that reveals more about us and our inability to adapt to new information than it does about the reality of Chinese lending, which, by the way, Chinese lending has a lot of problems. Poor due diligence, lack of transparency, poor governance, lots of things we can talk about in terms of crappy governance of Chinese lending. Debt trap is just not one of them.
Okay, so let's just follow up. I think the exhibit A in almost every debt trap discussion is Hambantota Port in Sri
Yes.
Lanka.
Yeah.
Tell me about
Okay.
Hambantota. Yeah.
So Hambantota happened this was back in 2016 when the Rajapaksa family of Sri Lanka, who by every definition of corruption, incompetence, and just pathetic governance, they ticked all of those boxes. They decided that they came from Hambantota and they wanted hospital, highways, roads, ports, everything, an airport, everything to be in Hambantota. Bear in mind that a short ways is the port of Colombo. So the lunacy of putting a giant port close to an active, already functioning port, crazy. Now, the Belt and Road was announced in 2013. And if you go back to the early days of the Belt and Road, it was basically an orgy of spending. And it was a little bit like the early days of the global war on terror, where if you went into, the Defense Department and said, I'd like a new project, and they go, we're not going to fund it. And then you put, well, it's about fighting Al-Qaeda. Great, we'll double the budget. Then if you said it's about fighting ISIS, great, we'll triple the budget. Everything got through. And in those early days of the Belt and Road, we're talking within 2 or 3 years, there was very little oversight, very little governance, which is one of the reasons why we saw this huge upswing in massive projects. So not only in Hambantota, but also in Kenya for the $6 billion standard gauge railway. And so there were very poor feasibility studies that were done. The Rajapaksas were saying, we want to do this. And the attitude of the Chinese at the time was, listen, we think this is a bad idea. Don't do it. But if you're going to do it, you're going to repay our debts. You're going to repay the loans. So knock yourselves out. We're giving you the money. You're going to have to repay it. Now let's fast forward. And there's a great study done by Johns Hopkins by 2 Sri Lankan scholars who actually went to the finance ministry in Colombo and asked for all the documentation on the Chinese loans. And sure enough, they got it. And so, I posted this on my LinkedIn. You can see it there, but I'll be happy to share this with you. And what they found was that it was actually not the Hambantota port that caused the debt distress in Sri Lanka. It was actually the Eurobond debt that had much shorter repayment periods. So they started moving into default because they fell behind on the Eurobond debt. So then the Sri Lankans go back to the Chinese and say, listen, we can't pay for the port now because we have to repay the Eurobonds. China Exim Bank and those guys said, we don't want the port. It's yours. No. We want the money. We don't want the port. The Sri Lankans basically said, nope, we're going to default on this thing. So one way or another, you're going to eat it. And so at that point is when they came up with the 99-year agreement that the Chinese would take it for 99 years. This was not something that the Chinese willingly did. And again, this sounds like I'm an apologist for these guys. I'm actually not. The research is there. I encourage you to go to the Johns Hopkins China-Africa Research Initiative report on Sri Lanka and Hambantota. And by the way, there's been a number of them. Matt Furchin, who is a top China scholar, he's written on this. And again, the evidence is not there to say that the Chinese conspired to take this port. And the reason why is the port is a dumb port. It has almost no traffic in it. It is not strategically located in Sri Lanka, and it just doesn't make a lot of economic sense. And so the Chinese can be blamed for crappy oversight and poor lending practices. But when you look at the evidence and what the research says, it was not a conspiracy to acquire a port in a crappy part of Sri Lanka.
So another part of the story is the so-called development of a string of pearls of ports along the Indian Ocean, Hambantota in Pakistan and further along.
That's right.
What do you think of that theory?
That one I actually have a lot more time for because the Indian Ocean is an area that the people don't pay enough attention to. That when you look at Chinese trade routes coming from the Middle East and Africa, they all pass through the Indian Ocean. So the Chinese are eager to protect those supply chains and those supply lines in the Indian Ocean. There's also a competition for sphere of influence with India that is traditionally considered the Indian Ocean to be their sphere of influence. So the string of pearls theory, I do have a lot more time for. It's one of the reasons why I get very frustrated when the discussion in Washington turns to Chinese military bases on the west coast of Africa, which makes zero strategic sense from the point of view of the Chinese. And again, no evidence whatsoever presented by the Pentagon or anybody else that indicates that this is actually a thing that's happening. Where you should focus attention is, as you pointed out, in the Indian Ocean. My guess is that we're going to see bases in the next 20 years, either submarine bases or light Navy bases for refueling and restocking, probably nowhere near the scale of what you're going to see a U.S. naval station would be like, but much smaller. But my suspicion is that's going to be the area simply because they want to protect their sea lanes. And that actually is not an unreasonable proposition for a country that is the largest trading country in the world to want to protect its sea lanes. Whether it was the British, the French, every maritime power has wanted to protect its trading lines. And so I find that on the one hand, I can see why Americans find this threatening, but on the other hand, I think there is a legitimate point that the Chinese have to be able to say, listen, we want to protect our sea lanes. That's not unreasonable for the second largest economy in the world.
Okay. So, whatever else is the rationale behind some of these moves, we do know that China's model is an excessively authoritarian one, and we are
Correct.
concerned about the spread, maybe not the ideological spread in a traditional Soviet sense, but at least China seems to want to see its model more adopted so that it can discredit the democratic model to some degree. And in service of that, we've seen this spread of Chinese sort of digital infrastructure to include kind of a surveillance state kind of thing. We talked about these smart cities, and it seems almost missionary in pushing out this idea. You also should have smart cities like we do,
Yeah.
and bringing in this idea of a surveillance state. Should we be concerned about that?
Oof. Okay. And this is not whataboutism. So, but I'm going to sound a little bit whataboutism. If you go to the city of London, that is the most photographed city in the Western world. New York is photographed up and down. Smart city technology is not uniquely a Chinese technology today. It is something that here in Southeast Asia we're seeing more and more. Singapore obviously has cameras everywhere and whatnot. So the Chinese have two agendas, I think, that are at play here. One is to sell Huawei and ZTE equipment. There's a profit motive that's here, and they're selling solar panels, they're selling smart cities, they're selling phones, you name it. It's what they're selling. Two is that they come in with and I think this is what's so concerning, is that the United States has long had values attached to the technology itself, whether it's weapon systems to governments with poor human rights, that the Pentagon previously, not today, but previously said, listen, we're not going to sell you this because we're concerned you're going to use it against your own people, or it's certain technologies. Then, like smart cities, the US and some Western countries have said, we're not going to do that. The Chinese come in and say, you buy it, you get to do whatever you want with it. We look the other way. That is different than them saying, we want to propagate our system onto you. Um, Countries like Ethiopia and Burkina Faso and others don't need the Chinese to tell them, how to kind of be oppressive. They can do that perfectly fine on their own. The Chinese provide a lot of the tools, but let's be very clear, particularly in places like South America and Africa, the market for repressive technology is extraordinarily rich from American, Israeli, Italian, Chinese, all sorts of companies. So the Chinese by no means have a monopoly on this market. And one of the things that you'll see in places like Zambia and Uganda and other places that have bought Chinese technology is that in these surveillance stacks that they have a diverse mix of tech from around the world. The Chinese are certainly part of it, but they're by no means alone. That's not meant to excuse anything as to what the Chinese are doing. But in terms of this idea that the Chinese are pushing a different model of governance that is far less democratic, 100%. There's no dispute there, and I don't think even the Chinese would dispute that. When we talk about internet governance, for example, they don't believe in the universal access to information. They don't believe in a universal internet. They believe that the cyber realm should be governed the same way as the physical realm, where there's a border, and within that border, you should be able to do anything you want with your cyber governance. So in countries like Nigeria, where misinformation is rampant, that finds a lot of appeal. And when the US starts criticizing Nigerians for cracking down on speech, then Nigerians get frustrated and they look to the Chinese who support them in that. So there we have that kind of example where there is actually quite a bit of appetite from a lot of global South governments to look to the Chinese for governance standards. And there's frustration, particularly coming from the West. Also, what they see from the West today is really not that inspiring. And so that again goes to where's the credibility for this concern, Ray, that you talk about, when in fact our societies are struggling as much as they are.
Is it that different from the old Soviet US Cold War scenario where the Russians would go in and basically give the autocrats whatever they wanted, and we would hold ourselves up uh, as a beacon of democracy, yet we'd support our own autocrats, so it would look like hypocrites? Is it the same
No,
sort
it's
of thing
very
now?
different. Very, very different. First of all, the Chinese aren't giving him everything that they want. If they were giving them everything that they want, the Chinese would be writing checks that are much bigger than they're writing today. When it comes to foreign aid, for example, the Chinese are quite stingy, actually. They don't give a lot of foreign aid. That's not in their culture. When it comes to even loans, remember that these are profit-seeking loans. A lot of these are commercial loans. That's not giving them everything that they want. In fact, the Chinese drive a pretty hard bargain with a lot of these countries. They don't let them off the hook on debt. The Soviets would have let them off the hook. The Soviets would come in and say, okay, the autocrat X, you get whatever you want because you hate the US. The Chinese aren't doing that. And remember, the Chinese are not they don't want to overthrow the Western system. They have profited enormously off the US-led international order. They profit here in Asia, for example, in the Western Pacific, the fact that the US is in South Korea and in Japan means that the Chinese don't have to spend 8% of their GDP on defense. This is an enormous benefit. The Chinese are a revisionist power, not a revolutionary power in this sense. And whereas in the Soviet era, it was much more binary. It was us and them. The Chinese do a lot of business with the Americans. Even in the Trump era, they're still doing an enormous amount of business. People like Haikinde Hichilema in Africa, or even the Vietnamese, or a lot of global South leaders, don't want to be forced to make this binary choice between the US and China. They want both. And so that's why it's very different today than it was in the Cold War.
Eric, why is China in Latin America? It seems an awful long way away, and they seem like they've been very geographically focused, right? They've been focused
Yeah.
on, as you say, securing their supply line, securing access to minerals, those kinds of things. What's in Latin America for China?
Oh, a lot. So basically, Latin America and China are basically very complementary to one another. So Latin America is a resource-rich, capital-poor region. China is up until recently, a capital-rich, resource-poor region. So the complementarities are obvious. And today more than ever, I think farmers in Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, I am consumed with watching videos about how they are suffering miserably because the Chinese have not bought any corn, any wheat, or any soybeans, or any sorghum in 2025. What have they done? They've shifted that all to Argentina and to Brazil. Those countries can produce agriculture and food at scale that the Chinese need. There's one of the only few places that can do it. Europe can do it, the US can do it, Russia can do it, and South America can do it. Not only do they produce food, they're also a major oil producer, critical mineral producer, and increasingly a market for Chinese products. Go to Brazil and you order food, it's going to come on a Chinese delivery service. You onto the social media, it's Carouso, which is one of the most popular social media apps in Brazil, Chinese. You want to listen to music, it's Chinese music streaming services. The port of Chancay in Peru now is going to be a gateway for Chinese autos, Chinese technology, and food coming back out. So in many ways, there is strong complementarities on trade between Latin and South American countries and China, and we're going to see a much deeper integration. That being said, the U.S. has very effective leverage over a lot of these countries. So we're seeing this with Mexico, who's just put a 50% tariff on Chinese imported goods. They had no choice. Claudia Sheinbaum was basically facing a shutdown of U.S.-Mexico trade. And because China did want to use Mexico as a backdoor into the U.S. to circumvent some of the tariffs. And so they're shutting that down. Panama and the Panama Canal, clearly exiting the Belt and Road was the kind of leverage. But it is a very contentious issue now in a number of Latin American countries that are having elections this year over the close relationship with China. So we're seeing in Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, and Brazil, China is going to be a central election issue coming up. but it's a very potent force. Bear in mind that China does twice the amount of trade with South America that it does with Africa. So this is an important trading relationship and one that is only going to get more important in the Trump era.
You mentioned Mexico putting tariffs on Chinese goods, but this is
Yeah,
not just U.S. pressure. This is China basically flooding the market with their manufactured goods. China being a mercantilist power,
yeah,
getting in the raw materials as you described, and selling their excess capacity of manufactureds at cut rate prices.
that's right.
Um, so I,
Um, but again, absent Trump, there's no evidence that Scheinbaum would have done this to the extent that she's doing it. Scheinbaum, this is a very important trading relationship. It's a $100 billion trading relationship between China and Mexico. China buys a lot of copper and oil in exchange for China selling a lot of consumer goods and cars and technology back into Mexico. But she did this under duress. There's no doubt.
but it's not just Mexico. I'm talking about also Indonesia, the Europeans putting tariffs on Chinese goods now.
Yeah.
Um, w- my concern as a trade guy is where does this end? Are we going into a trade war now with all countries against China?
Well, it's interesting because in Global South countries, they have tried to put up the resistance the way that Trump has done with the de minimis tariff. And so Trump removed the de minimis exemption. So in South Africa, they put a policy forward to tariff anything under $20 coming from China. In Indonesia, they put up a similar one. They've never really followed through. And there's a couple of different reasons here. Number one is that Chinese products around the world, even in the US, have become such a key part of daily life. And already these countries are facing inflationary pressures, just like in the United States. So adding tariffs onto some of these goods can hit everyday consumers, and politicians don't want to do that. That's number one. Number two is that a lot of us have become dependent on Chinese e-commerce companies. So here in Southeast Asia, we buy from Lazada. That's Alibaba, and making those products more expensive, goes to the heart of a lot of vested interests in elite circles who profit off of the import export of goods, whether it's at the customs or whether it's the access to the distribution networks and whatnot. They have political influence at the top, and they have resisted some of these things. What we have, though, and you're right, James, is a flooding of the market of Chinese products that are really competing with producers around the world, and which in many ways are going to keep the global south or these developing countries stuck at the bottom of the value chain. Because if you cannot create a product that's cheaper than the cheap Chinese import, then you're never going to find a market for it. And so this is the contradiction of China and the global south. On the one hand, it's been a blessing because it provides a market for agriculture, commodities, raw materials that is on a scale which nobody can replicate. But on the other hand, it's the very force that's going to keep poor countries poor because China is holding on to the light manufacturing, the apparel manufacturing, that low-end manufacturing that normally countries, as they advance up, they drop and they let those products go. Xi Jinping has made it very clear he wants to hold on to that light manufacturing because there's one lesson that Xi Jinping has taken away from Donald Trump and from Brexit and from the rise of populism in Europe, is that when you deindustrialize, it can trigger populist backlashes. And that's the same in China as it is in Lille, France, as it is in Ohio. And so he's holding on to this manufacturing in part because he knows that he doesn't want to generate the type of unemployment that we've been dealing with that can produce a Chinese version of Donald Trump. That is absolutely what he wants to do. But that fundamentally keeps poor countries poor because you will never be able to sell a car to the Chinese or a shirt to the Chinese because they can make that on their own cheaper than anybody else can do. That's a fundamental contradiction of what the Chinese are doing in the global south.
Eric, it is now exit question time. So I'm going to go here with this. You, as we mentioned off the top, are a longtime journalist. What made you decide to settle down in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, and be a China Global South producer of visual and written and podcast information?
Yeah. So my background is as a China journalist, and I started going to China in the 80s, and I lived there all through the 90s, and I worked at CNN and all the networks that you mentioned very kindly in my introduction. And so I've been a China watcher my whole career. I then went to Africa starting in the mid noughts, 2005, 2006, and started to kind of see what China was doing there. And I started the China Global South Project in 2010. That back then it was called the China Africa Project. And it was just meant because I felt that the coverage of China was either that China is this kind of neo-colonialist villain, as we see, or it was this propaganda coming from the Chinese of win-win, everybody's happy. And when I interviewed my Congolese employees and I asked them, I said, what do you guys think about the Chinese? And my Congolese employees at the time, back in 2010, they sat back and they kind of thought about it, and they never really thought about it until I asked them. And they said, I like this, but I don't like that. And a light bulb went off in my head that said, that's it. The story isn't black or white, good or bad. The story is that China is a complex actor. Just like the US is a complex actor, just like Japan is a complex actor. If you're only looking at the bad, you're missing half the story. If you're only looking at the good, you're missing half the story. So that kind of sent me down this pathway as a content creator, if you call it, back in 2010 in the early days. And I did this thing as a side hustle, as a passion project. I was working still in journalism at Radio France International, France 24, all those different places. And then the opportunity came for me to come to Vietnam to run back then what was the largest cable news television station, Financial Business News Channel, FBNC, which is no longer with us, and just loved it. And this is literally the best place to be right now to look at China, because Southeast Asia more broadly is the front lines of the global power contest, which is why the podcast you guys are doing is so important about why should we care. But the Indo-Pacific is the most important region in the world today. The population is here, the wealth is here, and the future of the global economy is here. It's not in the West, it's not in Europe, it's not anywhere else. And so being here to cover China is absolutely fantastic and just a wonderful opportunity. And the low cost of living, it's super cheap.
All I heard there is that Eric Olander says that people should like and subscribe to our podcast. That's all I heard.
That's it. And I agree.
What Eric
Eric, this
meant
has
to
been
say.
really fascinating, really challenging. We definitely need to come back and do this again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it and love the show.
Great.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks so much. And of course, our sponsor is Bauer Group Asia, a strategic advisory firm that specializes in the Indo-Pacific. Bauer Group applies unmatched expertise and experience to help clients navigate the world's most complex and dynamic markets. My co-host, Jim Carouso, is a senior advisor with Bauer Group, and you can visit their website at bauergroupasia.com. Jim, Eric Olander brings definitely a very different perspective than most of our guests.
Well, he's taking very much a developing country, third world, global south, whichever term or not you want to use, of the situation as they see it. I've heard it before from locals. I haven't heard it expressed by an American quite so eloquently.
No.
But
I mean,
fun.
honestly, frankly, as a 35-year U.S. military officer, I don't like to listen to a lot of it. I don't. I kind of like Team USA. I kind of think we're the good guys.
Well, we try to be, but sometimes we don't do that very well. And the fact of the matter is, when we gave aid in the past, it was a lot of aid that went through by congressional mandate through U.S. contractors doing projects that U.S. Congress identified very often, not what the host country necessarily wanted. So even our aid, which made us feel good, wasn't always seen in the best light.
Yeah.
Whereas the Chinese go in and say, "What do you want? We'll give it to you." I know
Well,
Eric said it's not everything,
we'll give
but
it to
it
you,
sure
or
like
we'll
it.
sell it to you.
Right, exactly. If we don't give it to you, we'll sell it to you. But we'll give you really positive financing terms.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, more
Sometimes.
often than not, because he says it's not a debt trap. Well, it's not designed as a debt trap, but I would argue sometimes it turns into one.
Yeah.
Because they want the money.
Right. So, but that Hambantota example, in the end, it was a debt trap, maybe not by design, but I do think that's helpful. Just kind of that that perspective, because we do often tend to, and one of my good friends here in town likes to, we all often have our little back and forths over. I'm the dragon slayer and he's the panda hugger, and but we, they're very congenial, and we actually really like kind of going back and forth on these things. But he says, oftentimes we act like China is 10 feet tall and that everything is coming out of the grand master strategy in Xi Jinping's office, where he's moving the little pieces around the board. And, I think that's a helpful reminder that a lot of it is just stuff that's going on. And the motivations are a lot more nuanced and complicated, as he liked to put it, than maybe we think they are in our risk board analysis.
We don't do nuance. Um, but speaking of nuance, he mentioned something about you testifying before a Senate committee. What's all this then?
Yeah, well, that was really interesting. So it was the East Asia subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I was there with a guy you remember very well, Dr. Eli Ratner. We had him on the podcast recently, and of course, he was in the Pentagon for a little while during the Biden administration, and also Craig Singleton from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, or democracies. And we were talking about China's gray zone operations in East Asia. And so, yeah, I was one of three witnesses, and we had Chairman Ricketts and Ranking Member Coons, and we talked through, and several other members who came in, and we talked through the issues. It was a really interesting experience.
Well, I actually watched it. I was very impressed. I don't know who that Ray Powell person was, but he
I don't
did
know
really
either.
well. And where can people see it if they're interested in what Ray Powell has to say for senators, not just me?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so the Senate Foreign Relations Committee does have a website, and if you basically go to the calendar part of their website, you'll see it there on the October 7th. You just click on it, and you can actually watch it, or you can download the testimony that each of us submitted. My submitted testimony, my written testimony, was like 13 pages, and of course, I only got 5 minutes opening statements, so a lot of stuff was in there that didn't come out in the opening statements. But I mean, first of all, Eli Ratner and Craig Singleton, brilliant guys, really, really impressive. I think that it is one of those places that, first of all, in Capitol Hill, I mean, one of those places in Washington, D.C. that's actually open right now, during the government shutdown. And actually, there was a lot of, you know, comedy and not comedy, comity and good feeling among the members, which again in Washington D.C. this time is rare. And in fact, I will say that some of the people who came in, at least one of the senators, and I won't name anybody, but one of the senators had been in the chamber in the hearing in the morning with Attorney General Pam Bondi, which had turned into quite a there was a lot of fireworks, we'll just say, and you can see everybody was a little frazzled, and in some ways they were happy that basically in the afternoon we could all sort of get along and just talk about the issues.
Well, it's a good thing Eric wasn't there.
That's true. That might have been a little testier. Um, but I mean, actually, so maybe one of the I'll get just maybe close on this. At the very end, I recommended to the senators that they go out and visit the Spratly Island group's only civilian population, which is a Filipino population out at T2 Island, or what they call Pagasa. And when I did it, I sort of indicated to Eli Ratner on my right that he might be squirming a little bit, because the sort of the foreign policy professionals have long avoided the appearance that we take any position on the sovereignty over any of the South China Sea features, just because it's such a thorny place. And basically what I've said is, I think we're past that now. I mean, right now, I think, sure, the Vietnamese would certainly put in a démarche, basically saying we claim that as part of Vietnam. But I think privately they'd be like, that's fine, because they know that they're not going to get the Filipinos off the island. And their biggest threat is that the Chinese will get them off the island, and then they'll be stuck with the Chinese there. So,
I think the Chinese might have a démarche as well.
yeah, maybe one or more. There
Yes.
may be more than a demarche, but that actually seemed to go over pretty well. And actually, Eli Ratner said, "Yeah, no, I kind of agree." So
The things you'll do to get a trip back to the Philippines are just
yeah.
incredible.
All right. Well, we do want to make sure that we give a shout out to our fantastic producer, Ian Ellis Jones and IEJ Media. If you have not if you're on X and you haven't followed him on X, you are missing out. So many people are getting so much out of his posts. At Ian Ellis Jones is his handle, at Ian Ellis Jones. Of course, if you enjoyed this episode, please stop what you're doing right now. Pull the car off the side of the road, pick out your iPhone, hit the like button, subscribe, 5 stars, tell them we're wonderful, tell them I'm better looking than Jim. If you are on social media, X, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, we're on all of them. Finally, we want to encourage you to email us, Indo-Pacific Podcast@gmail.com, Indo-Pacific Podcast@gmail.com. And we want to thank our fantastic sponsors, BauerGroupAsia.com. If you do go and give them a call, make sure you let them know that you heard about it here so that we can keep this great relationship going. So for Ian and Jim, I'm Ray. Until next time, join us again on Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?